Alrighty, welcome everyone. We appreciate you joining us today for this virtual training class. My name's John Weber. I'm the overall meeting host, kind of logistical manager here, and I have with me Win Worrell, who's a technical product manager, uh, started out in product support, technical application consulting, and he's going to just do some introduction, go over the tools that are used that Ganesh is using as he teaches. And then Ganesh is our teacher for the day, and he's a technical lead on these tools, and you'll be spending most of your time with him. Logistically, we have a Q&A panel where you can submit questions. Win or myself may answer those directly, privately, or share with the whole group as appropriate. We may also hold questions for a pause period for a good time to have Ganesh cover them. We'll kind of manage that so that you're able to get your questions answered. And with that, let's get things started, Win. I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks, John. So let's just talk about the agenda today. I'm going to start with a brief technical overview of the requirements of Visual Studio versions and .NET versions and Windows versions we support, things like that. And then Ganesh will show you how to get started with the data client in Visual Studio. He's also going to show some examples of how to read and write using the codeless binding. The codeless binding can be useful when you're trying to bind tags directly to objects on the form. We know that's not always the way you use the toolkit, so we're also going to show you how to write a little bit of code and read and write from an OPC UA server. And then at the end, we'll leave some time for covering the questions that have come through. So during the training today, Ganesh will be using the most current version of Data Client in Visual Studio 2019, and we'll be communicating with the top server using OPC DA and OPC UA. The Data Client supports development for the .NET Core, .NET Standard, and .NET Framework. And because of this, we can support deployment for both Windows and Linux. The toolkit has been both interoperability tested and OPC Lab certified to ensure that we have compliance with the OPC standard. Minimum, the current version requires Windows 7 with Visual Studio 2017 or newer. If you need support for an earlier OS or Visual Studio version, just let us know. We have older versions that you can test with. We just need to know, what version of Visual Studio you need to support or .NET Framework, and we can provide that. The tool supports a variety of different languages, and for this training, Ganesh will be developing in VB.NET. The tool supports OPC UA for data access and alarms and conditions. It also supports some OPC classic specifications like OPC DA, OPC ANE, and XML DA. Now, that's really all I had. At this point, I'm going to turn the training over to Ganesh now that we've kind of framed what you need to use to develop against this toolkit. And let me stop sharing and give the control back over to him.
My name is Ganesh, and I'll be your instructor for today's class. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I'm glad that you all can join us today. So like you said, today we're going to do a few things. First, we're going to add the data client controls to the Visual Studio Toolbox. Then we'll use a no-code method using the live binding model to read, subscribe, and write to a tag in my OPC server. And then we're going to write a little bit of code in VB.NET. I want to go ahead and mention that we do have plans to also provide you with an identical application to what you'll see today in C#. I did see some of you use other development languages such as C and Python, and we have examples in those languages as well that we will make available to you. So to start, anytime I add something to the Visual Studio Toolbox, I like to add a tab and name it appropriately. And then we'll choose items. These are all going to be .NET Framework components. I'm going to browse to the install directory where you'll find these DLLs that we need to add. And there are 5 DLLs in here that we need to add. And I know what some of you might be thinking right now. These are a lot of DLLs. How would I possibly know which 5 to add? Well, you do it long enough, you might know, but a little pro tip here. If you sort these by size, it's actually the 5 largest ones that you add. And you can add all 5 at once, so I selected all of those. And I will click open. Okay. So I added all 5 just to cover our bases, just so you can see here that there are very many controls and dialogues that we can use with the OPC data client. Today, of course, we'll just be using a few of those. So to start, we're gonna go ahead and start our no code portion of the training. To start, we're gonna add this DA connectivity control. But while we're still in here in the toolbox, I do want to point out that there's a UA connectivity control as well. Everything that I do here for the no code portion will be for OPC DA, but you can do it for OPC UA as well. Likewise, for the code part, which will be in OPC UA, you can do as well in OPC DA. So when I added that DA connectivity control, you can see that I added a point binder and a binding extender control as well. I'm also going to go ahead and add a button and a text box. I'm going to name these, give these a more appropriate name. So this is my no code text box. And this will be my no code write button. And I'm also going to want to change the label on that. I'll do execute write. Just make it a tad bigger to show that. Now I want to select this text box because this is the control that I want to actually bind to my OPC tag. Come down here to bind to point. It brings up this point editor. This point editor is going to be a OPC DA server browser. So I'm going to browse the local machine. You can see these are all the OPC DA servers that I have on my machine. The one we're using today is the Toolbox OPC Power Server. Some of you may be familiar with that, known as just the top server. And the tag that I'm interested in today is channel1.device1.tag1. I do want to show you all this real quick. These DA properties over here. And these are the DA properties that top server is exposing to the data client right now. And I'm only pointing this out because I have had users that have a need to access these properties. There is a data client method to get property ID, and using, or get property value is the method, and using these property IDs, you can access these. Sometimes people need to access the data type, or they want to know the value of the tag. And in this case, you can check with the value property without actually performing a full read down to your device. So I just wanted to point those out real quick. So my tag 1 is the one that we're binding to. And that's the bare minimum for this. Right now, this text box is bound to that tag 1 in my top server to read and subscribe. The subscription by default is a 1-second update rate. I'm going to come down here to live to edit live bindings so we can look at this in a little more detail. So yeah, by default, it's going to read and subscribe. you can see the subscribe parameters, 100 milliseconds or 1000 milliseconds, excuse me. And of course we can change that if we want to. But I didn't add that write button for nothing. I do want to be able to write as well. So I'm going to select this there. You can see now my binding operations are all. But to be able to actually perform that write, we need to change the source component of our write event source to be that write button that we added. So now you can see that when that button is clicked, that's what's going to trigger this write event. And down here you can see that's the item that we added, and we're looking at the value. You can also change this. You can make it so that we are accessing the timestamp or the quality. I have seen people in the past, they'll put on their form 3 text boxes, each one representing, one for value, one for timestamp, one for quality. And that's how you would do that. You would just create 3 different bindings and change the argument's path for the point that you're referencing. So we'll click OK there. Save. And let's run the application and see what that functionality looks like right now. Okay. So as you can see, it automatically subscribed with a value of 40, but don't take my word for it. This is another client that's communicating to the same tag. You can see here the value is also 40. So let's try to do a write from here. So I execute that write. You see it update in the quick client. And now let's perform a write from the quick client. And we see it update back in our application. So far so good. It's working just as we'd expect. Now I do want to build on this a little bit just to show you guys. We have this industrial gadgets. This is a graphics add-on that Software Toolbox offers. I'm going to use this meter control. And we're also going to bind to this. What I want to show you by doing this is that this is not limited to just Microsoft Windows form controls. Any .NET component that you have in here, this binding extender does exactly that. It extends the functionality of that control and allows it to implement OPC. So we're going to pretty much do the same thing. I'm going to come down here, except I'm going to go to live bindings, edit live bindings, and I'm just going to add it here. We're only going to read and subscribe. There's no read event source or write event source that I need to trigger, but I am going to browse for that point again. And we'll just come down in here, select the same tag. And yep, make sure that's there. The other thing we want to make sure here is that the value target is tied to the value, so that that meter control knows that it's going to use the value to change where that dial is. I'm also going to come into these gadget properties real quick. You can see you can change the appearance here. I'm going to remove the units, but you can obviously change that to whatever you need. I'm going to put tag 1 just because that's the name of the tag that I'm communicating with. Apply those changes. Okay. And let's see that in action real quick. Look at, no, I did not. Okay, here it goes, and you can see that just like our text box, this little meter over here shows a value of 40. If I update that, the meter updates with the value as well. And so as we can see here, that didn't take much time at all, and we are able to read and write to this tag in our OPC server without writing a single line of code. That concludes the instruction on the no code part. One thing I do want to mention is that it is possible to implement like error handling without writing any code as well. We certainly have documentation on that we can provide. It involves using this Windows Control Error Provider. Unfortunately, due to time, we're not going to do that, but I did want to mention that that is possible, that even for error handling, you do not need to write code. And so, yeah, that concludes the no code portion. To begin our code portion of this training, I have a few more items that I want to add to my form. So to do that, I'm gonna organize my form a little bit, clean it up, since we're gonna have a handful of controls here. Just gonna put a label up here, no code method with live binding. Oops. Oh, sorry, that was the name. Text. No code method with live binding. And then another one down here. And I'll do a low code method. So I'm going to do a text box and two buttons. One will be to read and another to write. And let me name these accordingly. Low code text box. Low code read button. Change the text as well. Low code write button. Right. Okay. Then I'm gonna double click my read button. Come back here, double click my write button. What that did was that created the event handler for me for both of those buttons. But before I actually get into the contents of those event handlers, let me do one thing real quick. I'm going to import some of the UA libraries. Before you're able to do something like imports OPC labs.easyopc.ua. So the only reason why that is able to get recognized is because I have that reference here. If that reference is not here, you just have to right click that, add reference, and then you can browse. And it's the same DLL that we had that contained the controls. So it's just that DLL right there, and you add that. So then, because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to instantiate our client object in the code. And so to do that, we need to reference these libraries, and that can't happen without that reference there. There's a second library that we're going to be using. Oops. Okay. And then I have some variables that I want to define globally. So first I'll start with instantiating my client object, dim UA client as new easy UA client. And then as you'll see in my read and write method, and really throughout, I'm going to be referencing a specific endpoint, a UA endpoint that corresponds to the top server, and a node ID that corresponds to the tag in top server. And I'm just going to scope those as variables as well. Dim endpoint descriptor as UA endpoint descriptor. Pretty straightforward. And then dim node descriptor as UA, you guessed it, UA node descriptor. So I have my libraries imported, I have those variables scoped. Now I can jump into the actual content of this read event first, and it is a single line of code, truly. I can do low-code.textbox because I want the text in that low-code text box to be equal to the item, the value of the item that I read. So OPC, the UA client dot read value. When you hit that parenthesis, I really like this about Visual Studio and the IntelliSense, brings up the possible overloads that we have. You can see the different options here. The one I'll be using is this endpoint descriptor, node descriptor. So pretty easy for me because I named my variables exactly that. Endpoint descriptor, node descriptor. The beauty of it is that while, yeah, IntelliSense is great and it can show you those overloads, we don't only have to rely on IntelliSense. We have really great documentation that shows this. So what I have here that I've just pulled up is the OPC Data Client User Guide. It's an online user guide, and it has this concise reference part of it. And you can see all these different methods. The read value method that we're using right now. This is the overload list. In just a moment, we're going to do the write value method. This is the overload list. And even later on, we have the subscribe data change that we're going to be using. But obviously, there's going to be situations where you want to read, write, and subscribe to more than one value. So there's the multiple values. There's also the write. There's the read multiple values, the write multiple values. And then for a subscription, you'll use the subscribe monitored item, and then you'll manage all the items that you want to monitor in a monitored item list. So, whether this is a single or multiple items, you can read, write, and subscribe with different methods. These are all UA methods. They are available. Similar methods are also available for OPC DA. So, that line of code for the read event, that's it. Now let me add the write event. And again, at a bare minimum, it's just this one line of code. And we're going to do write value. Again, you see the overload here. This is the one I'll be using. It's endpoint descriptor, node descriptor, and then the value. And now you can statically define a value here. If I put 100, every time I click that write button, a value of 100 is going to be written. But I want to leave this open-ended. I want it to be dynamic. So I'm actually, instead of a static value, I'm going to put low-code textbox.text. What that means is that anything that I have typed in that low-code text box, when I click that write button, it's going to write whatever value is in that text box to my node. I'm realizing here actually I've declared these up here, but I actually didn't set them to anything, so they're not doing me any good right now. This UA endpoint right here, this is pretty typical for OPC UA, this format. You're going to see something that kind of looks like this no matter what OPC UA server you're connecting to. You'll have a little header, then the machine IP address or machine name, and then a port number that's being used. For you KEP server users, this might look a little familiar, except your port is 49320. And then my node descriptor. The namespace index is top server. And then the actual item, that S, that represents a string, because my item ID that I'm passing right here is in a string format. Sometimes the item ID is just an integer. It's represented by an integer, so it would be I equals, and then whatever represents that UA node, and there. So now that I actually have those set, these actually mean something. So this will work. This is with just 2 lines of code in each of the events, or 1 line in each of the events. Scope some variables, and we haven't even used this one library yet, and I declared a library. I can read and I can write. Let's run this application, see what the functionality is looking like right now. Okay, so a value of 100, and I'm going to read. All right. And now let me write a new value. We see it update on both of our controls up here. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to implement some error handling. As we said at the beginning of this training, everything that we do is going to just build on each other. So again, this is the bare minimum of code that you need, but we're going to build on this. So we're going to add a try-catch method around both of these lines of code, so that we can catch things like this. This test, this is a string. What I'm about to do is I'm going to try to write a string to a tag that I know is an integer. It's not going to work. If I write that, my application crashes and it cites an operation failure, OPC UA operation failure. So let me stop that. And like I said, we're going to add a try-catch. Okay, and then down here, obviously this is saying try to read the value, but catch an exception. And if we do catch an exception, it's going to look something like this. Oh, you know what? I forgot a key piece. Sometimes you can output these exceptions when they're caught to a message box, in which case a new window will pop up in front of your application. But I want to keep those exceptions in-house. I don't want a message box to pop up every time I get an error. I'm going to add this list box down here, and this list box is going to act like our event log, essentially. That's exactly what it's going to be for us. It's going to be an event log. So because it's going to be an event log for us, I'm going to change its name to event log. So I can go event log dot items dot add, and then I'm going to add some static text to the output. I'm going to say read failed. Whoops, gotta put that in quotes. Read failed, colon, and then the 0 in the curly braces, that is simply a placeholder for what the exception actually is. And this is UA exception. So UA exception dot get base exception. dot message. Oops. Sorry, that is not right. That it should be that. That's right. Now down here, this is going to be pretty much the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this, paste. Again, it's a UA. And of course we want it to say write failed. Now there's no problem in me having both of these catches named X because they're in completely different subs. So that is it for implementing the try catch. And now we are going to go ahead and run this application and try to force those errors and see how the event log handles that. Okay, first let's read that tag. Got a value of 0. But let's perform that same test where we're going to try to write a string to this tag, knowing that the tag is an integer. So let's do that right. And saying the input string was not in the correct format. So it's getting cut. The error message is getting cut off there. So I do want to make a change on my event log here. In the properties, there's a horizontal scroll bar that I can set true. By default, it's set false, and so that way we can see more of the error. I'm gonna change the horizontal extent as well. Give it some space. Anyway, let's run that again. So yeah, like we just did, we just triggered that write failure. And we can see a little more, attempting to change an object of type string to a uint 16, so an unsigned 16-bit integer. And I'm gonna shut down the top server momentarily. And you can see right when I shut it down, the subscription up here stopped. But I shut it down so I can fail a read as well. Read failed. No connection could be made because the target machine actively refused it. Obviously, the connection was refused because the OPC server is not available. But I'm going to start it back up to show you all a feature that our users are very appreciative of, and it's that this subscription picked up almost right away after the OPC server came back online. OPC data client under the hood does handle failure recovery for you. It's not something that you have to worry about in your code. So moving right along, we have written our read value method, our write value method. We have error trapping established for both of those. The next thing that we're going to do is write a subscription. Now the code for subscription is going to be a bit longer than what we see here because with a subscription, there is an on data change event that gets fired, and that data change notification that comes back to the client to let the client know that the value in the OPC server has changed. We need to handle that here in the code. So we are going to do that next. We're going to do it a little differently though. This UA node descriptor up here, if you're not familiar with OPC UA or familiar with your OPC UA server, this node descriptor can be quite daunting if you're not familiar with this format and the syntax. So we're gonna do our subscription, but we're gonna do it without having to know what our node descriptor is. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to utilize the data client's dialogues, browsing dialogues. So if we look at our data client controls, you can see there are some UA controls and dialogues. There's some DA item dialogues and things here as well. The one that we're going to use, because the way that I'm going to do it, we're not going to browse for our OPC server. The UA endpoint is straightforward, so I am going to pass that as a property of this UA data dialog. As when I select that, you can see endpoint descriptor is a property of that. So I do have to declare what the endpoint is going to be, but I'm going to do that in code in just a second. I do want to add a few more things. I want to add 2 buttons, and I want to add 2 text boxes, and I'm going to give all of these names. This first button, this is going to be the button that I'm using to actually browse for the UA item. UA item browse button. And I want that when I browse for the UA item and I select that, I want the UA node descriptor to be outputted to this text box. Let me change this real quick. Make it a little bit bigger so we can see all of that. So like I was saying, when I select my node descriptor, I want it to populate this text box. So that's why I'm going to call this UA item text box. Now this button, whoops, didn't mean to do that. This button, this is going to be the one that triggers the subscription. So this is my low code subscribe button. And I want the text on it to say subscribe. And then lastly, this text box here, I want the value of the subscription to output to this text box. So it's just going to be called low code subscribe text box. Okay. So to start with the code, I'm going to double click on the browse. I'm going to double click on the subscribe. And there's actually a third event handler that I'm just going to paste in that I had from previously. And this, as I mentioned, this last event is what's going to handle the data change notification that we get from the OPC UA server. So for the UA item browse button, when we click that, we want the data dialog to pop up. So we're going to do UA data dialog 1 dot endpoint descriptor equals endpoint descriptor. If you recall, this endpoint descriptor right here, this is referring to my global variable. So that's me designating the endpoint descriptor for the items that I'm going to be browsing for. Then from here, I'm going to say if UA data dialog show dialog equals dialog result dot OK, meaning I click that OK button on the dialog, Then I want my UA item text box. I want the text of that to be equal to the node ID that I select in the UA data dialog. Now in my subscribe button event, I first need to put in a reference to the handler below. So add handler, UA client, dot data change notification, comma, address of, and then my data change notification event name. And we can see this event handler down here now has one reference. The next line of code in here is going to be the actual subscription. So UA client dot subscribe data change. And we can see there's 7 possible overloads. The one that I'm using is this first one. Endpoint descriptor. But I'm not going to pass my node descriptor variable here. Recall that we're using the UA data dialog to select what our node descriptor is. So here I'm going to put UA item text box.text because I want the text that is currently there to be what gets used for the subscription. And this last piece is the sampling interval, or how quickly we want that subscription to update in milliseconds. So I'm just going to do 1,000 milliseconds. And now we're going to have an if-else statement here in the data change notification event handler. So we're going to say if E succeeded, then we want our low code subscribe text box, the text of it, to be equal to the value property of the attribute data that we get as part of this data change event that gets fired. Else, meaning if anything besides this event succeeding occurs, meaning there's probably an error, want to make sure that our event log catches that. And there we go. So that is it for the code. Our form looks good. Go ahead and save that. And let's start the application, and we can test it for its full functionality. So our text box up here and our meter automatically begin subscribing. I'm going to read. Then I'm going to update the value. You can see it update here and here. Now I'm going to browse. So you can see the endpoint descriptor that we declared is automatically inherited here. So it knows exactly what OPC UA server to browse for. So again, our tag 1, this text box gets populated with the node descriptor. Then I'm going to click subscribe, and there it goes. It is subscribed. So let me write a new value and see that text box update, and there it goes. I think we've put together a pretty nice little application here. We greatly appreciate your time for sticking with us and participating in our training today. Of course, there's so much more that you can do here, especially with code, as long as you're following good development practices. We will get this application to you. I may have mentioned this already. We'll be doing the same application but in C#, and we'll be getting that to you as well as some other resources. And of course, our team is always available as a resource.